So, Washington expected Canada to fold, but Carney had already secured the exit. The United States placed a 50% tariff threat over roughly $28 billion in Canadian exports. The deadline was August 19th. The pressure was designed to make every Canadian option look worse than accepting Washington's terms. But before the order was announced, Ottawa had already moved the critical pieces: a Pacific gateway connected to 170 markets, a European defense agreement tied to a €150 billion procurement system, nearly 20 new economic and security partnerships, and trade agreements advancing through the Gulf and South America. 4 days after the tariff announcement, Canada concluded negotiations with the United Arab Emirates and signed a free trade agreement with Ecuador. The trap was supposed to close in 30 days. The exit had been under construction for more than a year. Warren Buffett once gave Berkshire managers a warning that now applies far beyond business. We can afford to lose money, even a lot of money. But we can't afford to lose reputation, even a shred of reputation. That is the economic core of what happened. The United States still has the larger market. Canada still has more immediate exposure. But tariff leverage depends on the other side believing access will remain valuable, dependable, and irreplaceable. Washington raised the price of access while Carney lowered the cost of leaving. This does not mean Canada escaped without pain. A 50% tariff on $28 billion can eliminate orders, reduce shifts, weaken retirement holdings, and raise prices on both sides of the border. August 19 remains a genuine threat. The shock is that Ottawa was no longer deciding whether to build an alternative. It was deciding how rapidly to activate one already supported by ports, agreements, financing, defense procurement, and foreign customers. When you hear what was inside the Canadian exit file, what officials saw when they placed $28 billion beside $100 billion in new port capacity, and why one date in the European agreement changed the entire room, you will understand why Washington's deadline no longer controlled every decision. Hit subscribe because this confrontation is moving from tariffs into infrastructure, alliances, and contracts that will outlast the people negotiating them. Let me give you the full context, because Canada's exit did not appear after the latest tariff announcement, and it was never one single deal. For generations, Canadian economic geography pointed south. Roads, railways, pipelines, power grids, factories, and regulatory systems were designed around the American market. An automotive component produced in Ontario could cross into Michigan, return to Canada for another stage, and cross again inside a finished vehicle. Canadian crude supplied American refineries. Prairie Potash supported American farms. The two countries did not merely trade finished products. They operated parts of the same industrial machine. That integration created wealth because it reduced friction. Transportation was short. Standards were familiar. Companies carried less inventory because they trusted the border. Pension funds could hold manufacturers, railways, banks, utilities, and energy companies without treating every election as a threat to the entire system. USMCA was supposed to preserve that confidence. The agreement governed approximately $1.6 trillion in annual North American commerce and placed disputes over dairy, automobiles, metals, procurement, energy, labor, and environmental rules inside a framework businesses believed would endure. Then the framework weakened. Washington imposed tariffs on Canadian-built vehicles and 50% duties on steel and aluminum. Canada introduced countermeasures. The United States demanded broader dairy access, changes to provincial restrictions on American alcohol, and tougher automobile content rules. Talks with Mexico advanced while negotiations with Canada remained under pressure. On July 1, the United States declined to extend USMCA for another 16 years. The agreement remained in force, but entered annual reviews that could continue until 2036. A one-year political cycle may be manageable for government. For a factory, mine, port, pipeline, or pension portfolio, annual uncertainty can destroy the assumptions supporting a 20-year investment. Then came July 20. Washington announced new 50% tariffs on a wide list of Canadian goods, effective August 19th. Approximately $28 billion in annual exports were exposed. The affected categories reached dairy ingredients, beverages, cement, wood products, furniture, machinery, electronics, clothing, and sporting goods. Energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals were excluded, but thousands of businesses remained vulnerable. 50%. $28 billion. August 19. The strategy was built around compressed time. Buyers would delay orders. Banks would review credit lines. Exporters would reduce production. Provincial leaders would demand retaliation. Washington expected that pressure to make a fast agreement politically unavoidable. But according to official Canadian documents, Ottawa had already adopted a different clock. The government set a goal of doubling exports to non-U.S. markets by 2035 and advanced the Port of Vancouver Gateway strategy before the tariff announcement. That gateway already moved roughly $1 billion in goods every day and connected Canadian producers with as many as 170 markets. Roberts Bank Terminal 2 was designed to increase container capacity by 50% and unlock more than $100 billion in annual trade capacity. The European route was moving as well. Canada signed its agreement to participate in the European Union's Safe Defence Procurement Framework on February 14. It began applying provisionally on April 13. The European Council formally concluded it on June 15. Canada became the first non-European participant in a system supported by up to €150 billion in joint procurement financing. The Gulf route had begun in November 2025, when Canada and the United Arab Emirates launched negotiations. The South American route was advancing through Ecuador. Canada had also pursued economic, energy, defense, and security partnerships across Europe, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. Most Americans saw disconnected announcements. Canadian officials saw redundancy. The emotional turning point arrived when Trump said Canada needed the United States, while the United States did not need Canada, and dismissed the importance of updating USMCA. That revealed the assumption beneath the tariff strategy. Canadian dependence was permanent, and Canadian resistance was temporary. For Ottawa, that was the line in the sand. The question was no longer how to restore the old certainty. It was how to ensure no future American deadline could place the entire Canadian economy in the same position. And inside one secure Ottawa meeting, the government was about to discover how much of that exit was already beyond Washington's reach. The following scene is a composite reconstruction based on the official timeline, public negotiating positions, government documents, and reported accounts from people familiar with the planning. It is not a verbatim transcript. The physical details and dialogue reconstruct the strategic decision revealed by what followed. The meeting began after sunset in a secure conference room in Ottawa. A long maple table occupied the center. Gray carpet absorbed the sound of footsteps. Two dark wall screens reflected the recessed lights. Provincial flags stood beside the Canadian flag near a narrow window whose blinds had been lowered. At every chair sat a black binder, a pencil, and a water glass. At Carney's place, 4 folders had been arranged in a straight line. United States exposure, Pacific Gateway, Europe and defense, and one carrying only a single word, exit. On top of the first folder sat the American Tariff Proclamation. 3 numbers had been written across the upper margin in red ink. 50%, $28 billion. August 19. A finance official began with liquidity. Some exporters could survive 6 months without normal American orders. Others could survive 6 weeks. Several would feel the pressure before August 19, because importers would not risk receiving goods after the 50% duty took effect. A shipment valued at $1 million could face a $1 million border charge. Carney listened without interrupting. His hands rested on the closed American folder. A paper coffee cup beside him had not been touched. Then the second screen came alive. The Pacific coast appeared. Rail lines moved west toward Vancouver and Prince Rupert. Shipping lanes extended toward Japan, South Korea, China, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the wider Indo-Pacific. The Pacific Gateway folder opened. The Port of Vancouver already moved approximately $1 billion in trade each day. It connected Canada with up to 170 markets. Roberts Bank Terminal 2 was designed to raise container capacity by 50%, support roughly 17,000 ongoing supply chain jobs, add more than $3 billion to annual economic activity, and unlock more than $100 billion in yearly trade capacity. $100 billion. The number did not represent guaranteed sales. Capacity was not revenue. A terminal did not create a buyer. But without capacity, no alternative market could become large enough to matter. The screen changed again. Prince Rupert, Stewart, LNG terminals, critical mineral corridors. bulk terminals for grain, potash, canola oil, and petroleum products. A transport advisor summarized the logic in a composite line that captured the plan. This does not replace the United States before August 19. It makes sure August 19 cannot be used the same way forever. The room became still. The Europe and Defense folder opened next. Signed February 14th. Provisionally active April 13th. Formally concluded June 15th. The tariff order had been announced July 20th. An official traced the dates with a pencil. The agreement was already active before Washington applied its latest pressure. Canadian aerospace, cybersecurity, shipbuilding, radar, ammunition, communications, critical mineral, and advanced manufacturing companies now had a pathway into European procurement supported by up to 150 billion euros. An advisor asked the question that changed the room. Can Washington block it through the tariff negotiation? The European specialist looked at the signed document. No. Silence. 5 seconds. Then 10. Then 15. No one touched the water glasses. The American proclamation remained open beneath the 50% figure. The European agreement remained open beneath the June 15 date. One document threatened access to a market Canada had depended upon for generations. The other created access to a market Washington could not close. Then came the Gulf File. The United Arab Emirates negotiations had been launched months earlier and were approaching conclusion. The agreement would cover agri-food, machinery, aerospace, engineering, clean technology, services, and investment. The relationship was small beside the United States, but it offered capital and a gateway into the Gulf, Africa, and South Asia. The Ecuador file followed. Two-way merchandise trade was approximately $2 billion, but the agreement extended Canada's Pacific-facing architecture along South America. None of the files replaced America. Together, they changed what refusal could mean. A secure call with Washington began. According to officials from both sides speaking publicly about negotiations, the American position was direct. Canada needed relief before August 19. The 50% tariff would create intense pressure. Ottawa had to move on dairy, alcohol access, automobile rules, and its countermeasures. The Canadian side acknowledged the exposure. Nearly 70% of Canadian exports still moved to the United States. The Pacific route required years. Europe could not absorb $28 billion overnight. The UAE and Ecuador were much smaller markets. The American official returned to the deadline. The Canadian official returned to durability. A temporary exemption could not justify abandoning the exit strategy. Any agreement had to survive annual USMCA reviews and be worth the paper it was written on. The reconstructed exchange was quiet. "You do not have another market this size," the American side said. "No," came the Canadian response. "We have another direction." The room fell silent again. That was the climactic moment. Washington had defined leverage as Canada's inability to replace the American market. Ottawa had defined escape as the ability to prevent the American market from being its only route. Carney looked at the 4 folders. The United States folder contained immediate pain. The other 3 contained slow, expensive, incomplete alternatives. But they were signed. They were financed. They were entering legal force. They were being built. The instruction that followed was measured. Continue negotiating. Do not retaliate before August 19th. Protect the companies on the $28 billion list. Accelerate Vancouver. Advance European procurement. Complete the UAE and Ecuador agreements. And stop planning any major Canadian industry around the assumption that American access would always remain stable. The exit folder closed with a soft, deliberate sound. The tariff proclamation remained on the table. The Pacific, European, and Gulf files were carried out of the room. Washington still controlled the immediate threat. Canada had already secured control over the next move. And 4 days later, the public record began confirming what had been activated. The immediate fallout moved quickly because the political deadline and the commercial calendar were now operating against each other. Carney publicly refused to retaliate in advance. He said Canada would do whatever was necessary if the 50% tariffs took effect, but acting before August 19 would be counterproductive. Ontario demanded a harder response. British Columbia raised critical minerals. Alberta and Saskatchewan warned against measures that would damage Canadian producers. According to officials familiar with the federal strategy, restraint served 3 purposes: preserve provincial unity, deny Washington a pretext for escalation, and give the exit architecture more time to mature. Washington's public account was blunt. Trump said Canada needed the United States while the United States did not need Canada. He dismissed the importance of renewing or updating USMCA and presented tariffs as evidence that companies would move production into America. Ottawa's public language was quieter and more damaging. Canada wanted a good agreement rather than a fast agreement. Any settlement had to be durable. Officials, premiers, and businesses had to believe it was worth the paper on which it was written. The contrast carried its own verdict. A government cannot demand confidence in market access while publicly dismissing the agreement that makes the access predictable. Then the dates began stacking. On July 24th, Canada and the UAE announced the successful conclusion of their trade negotiations, one of the fastest agreement processes Canada had completed. The same day, Canada and Ecuador signed a free trade agreement. The Pacific Gateway strategy was already before the Major Projects Office. Roberts Bank had a selected construction partner. The SAFE agreement was already in force. The exit was no longer one announcement that Washington could pressure Ottawa to cancel. It was a series of legal and physical facts. The financial system noticed the distinction. The Canadian dollar remained under pressure, and speculative short positions had reached $12.5 billion. But the Toronto stock market absorbed the tariff threat, rose as investors recognized that energy and critical minerals were excluded, and reached record territory during the same period. That did not mean investors believed Canada was safe. It meant they stopped treating Canada as one undifferentiated tariff victim. Banks could suffer credit stress among exposed exporters while financing ports, railways, LNG facilities, mines, data centers, defense programs, and new manufacturing capacity. Resource producers could benefit from global demand. Infrastructure companies could receive long-term work. Canadian manufacturers selling covered products into the United States could still face severe losses. The market began separating the trap from the exit. According to business representatives on both sides of the border, procurement departments also began making quiet changes. American importers examined contract clauses and alternative suppliers. Canadian exporters requested additional working capital and studied European or Asian certification. Companies that had postponed diversification because the American market was easier began reconsidering whether ease was worth the political concentration risk. At a 50% rate, a C$2 million shipment could still carry a C$1 million tariff. Nothing in the UAE agreement, the Ecuador agreement, SAFE, or Vancouver eliminated that immediate bill. What they changed was the expected response to the bill. Before the exit strategy, a lost American order was simply a loss. After the exit strategy, it became evidence supporting investment in another route. This is where the second Buffett principle entered the analysis. Buffett has spent a career distinguishing a temporary price shock from a permanent change in earning power. The tariff threatened current revenue. Canada's response was aimed at preserving future earning power by increasing customers, corridors, and institutional access. The public confrontation therefore concealed a different race. Could Washington force concessions before August 19? Or could Ottawa make enough of the exit irreversible before the next tariff threat? The answer would not be found only in a negotiating room. It would be found in construction contracts, procurement lists, rail capacity, foreign certifications, and the next factory a Canadian company decided to build. And Warren Buffett's framework explains why those slow decisions may matter more than the loud deadline. Buffett's economic translation begins with one question. What is the policy teaching the other side to do? A tariff is designed to change behavior by increasing the cost of refusing a demand. But incentives do not stop at the negotiating table. The same tariff can increase the return on every investment that reduces future exposure to the country imposing it. That is the hidden transaction. The 50% tariff increases the cost of selling covered goods into the United States. It also increases the value of a Pacific terminal, a European defense contract, a Gulf customer, an Ecuadorian agreement, a new rail connection, and a second source of working capital. Washington is not merely charging Canada for access. It is helping Ottawa justify alternatives that once looked inefficient. In more than 60 years of buying businesses, studying managers, and negotiating with people who controlled assets he wanted, Warren Buffett built his record around durable earning power rather than the drama of one quarter. A business is not valuable merely because one customer has nowhere else to go today. It is valuable when customers continue choosing it after they have options. The American market was Canada's most efficient option. Efficiency, however, is not resilience. An efficient supply chain reduces spare capacity and inventory. A resilient system accepts additional expense in exchange for another supplier, another buyer, another port, or another route. For decades, Canada accepted concentration because American access appeared dependable. The border was close. USMK created rules. The alliance extended across NORAD and Five Eyes. Businesses believed the structure would survive political disputes. The latest tariff strategy changed that calculation. A longer route to Asia became more reasonable. European certification became more valuable. Gulf investment became more attractive. A $100 billion port capacity project became easier to defend. Redundancy stopped looking wasteful and began looking like insurance. Insurance always has a cost. The question is, what risk makes the premium worth paying? For Canada, that risk is no longer one tariff. It is the possibility that access to the American market can be reopened as leverage every year through 2036. Buffett's reputation rule matters because trust functions like capital. Trusted partners hold less inventory. They sign longer contracts. They build specialized facilities. They accept dependency because they believe it will not be exploited without restraint. When reputation weakens, companies demand stronger legal clauses, diversify suppliers, ensure political risk, hold more cash, and maintain duplicate capacity. They place the next plant near a port rather than near the border. Those costs are not recorded as tariff revenue. They appear across balance sheets and eventually reach consumers, workers, and retirement accounts. A retiree does not need to own a Canadian exporter directly to feel the effect. Pension funds hold banks financing exporters, railways moving their goods, utilities powering facilities, manufacturers buying inputs, and construction companies exposed to higher material costs. A customs duty travels through margins, prices, wages, interest rates, and asset values. Your 401k lost 3% in a single quarter because of this trade war. And according to me, it is only going to get more expensive from here. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something that I think every American over 60 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering, the tariffs, the inflation, and the impact on retirement savings, I have compiled into a complete guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's investment principles to the specific threat this trade war poses to your retirement. Your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income are all covered, along with a real protection plan you can start this week. The link is right below this video. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. Check it out. The American advantage remains real. Nearly 70% of Canadian exports move south. Europe cannot replace that market. Vancouver cannot redirect $28 billion before August 19. The UAE and Ecuador are much smaller relationships. But leverage is judged at the margin. Canada does not need to replace every American customer. It needs enough alternatives to protect targeted industries, enough infrastructure to redirect future growth, and enough institutional access to make refusal survivable. That is why $100 billion in port capacity matters beside $28 billion in tariff exposure. One is current commerce at risk. The other is the scale of future commerce that may not need American permission. Buffett's universal principle is simple. Never risk an essential long-term asset to gain a temporary advantage. The essential American asset was not merely Canada's trade volume. It was Canada's assumption that the United States would remain the default destination for its next dollar of investment. The temporary advantage was pressure before August 19, and a Buffett-style verdict would land with clinical force. Washington expected Canada to fold because it controlled the old route. Carney had already secured an exit for the next one. That is not an immediate Canadian victory. It is American leverage beginning to depreciate because of the behavior it caused. The cascading consequences begin with infrastructure, because infrastructure turns political intention into economic fact. Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is designed to increase Vancouver's container capacity by 50% and unlock more than $100 billion in annual trade capacity. Once capital is committed, those assets create their own constituencies. Workers train for them. Banks finance them. Provincial governments depend on their revenue. Exporters design contracts around them. Ports do not unbuild because Washington later offers an exemption. Contracts do not unsign because August 19 passes. The economic consequence is therefore larger than the $28 billion currently exposed. It includes the future factories, mines, processing plants, energy projects, and technology companies that may now be built around non-U.S. demand. A Canadian company entering Europe through CETA or SAFE pays the cost of certification, local partnerships, procurement registration, and regulatory compliance. Once those costs are paid, returning to total American dependence becomes less attractive. The political consequence will spread through both countries. Ontario manufacturers and Quebec processors face immediate risk. British Columbia gains national influence as the Pacific Gateway expands. Alberta and Saskatchewan gain from additional routes for energy, potash, uranium, grain, and canola. Atlantic Canada gains from European and Gulf shipping links. Across the border, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and New York cannot treat the conflict as a distant foreign policy exercise. American auto plants depend on Canadian components. Builders depend on Canadian wood products, cement, metals, and machinery. Farmers depend on Canadian customers. Unions representing steelworkers and machinists have urged cooperation with Canada rather than measures that fragment the North American industrial system. The devastating irony is direct. A policy presented as protection for American workers is forcing American workers to defend the Canadian supply relationships that the policy threatens. The institutional consequence may be even more expensive. USCA was negotiated during Trump's first administration and presented as a durable improvement over NAFTA. If Washington can decline a long extension, require annual reviews, and impose new duties on covered goods, every future American trade partner must question what a signed agreement actually secures. That question raises the cost of all American commitments. Japan will ask it. Germany will ask it. South Korea, Australia, the United Kingdom, Poland, and the Philippines will ask it. If Canada, the closest, most integrated, and most defense-aligned American partner, needs ports, European procurement, Gulf capital, and new agreements as insurance against Washington, every other ally will calculate how much insurance it requires. Then come the defense consequences. NORAD depends on radar, aircraft, satellites, communications, fuel, critical minerals, and trusted industrial suppliers. Five Eyes depends on confidence deeper than ordinary diplomacy. Arctic security depends on Canada and the United States coordinating infrastructure and surveillance, while Russia expands military capabilities and China seeks greater polar access. Canada's participation in Europe's SAFE system does not mean Ottawa is abandoning NORAD or Five Eyes. It means Canadian defense firms and planners have another industrial platform. Military procurement creates unusually durable ties. A radar contract leads to maintenance, software, spare parts, training, upgrades, and replacement programs. A shipbuilding partnership can organize hundreds of suppliers around one alliance relationship. The economic exit gradually becomes a strategic option. The international signal benefits America's adversaries even when Canada remains firmly inside the Western alliance. China gains whenever Canadian companies require alternative buyers, processing capacity, capital, or electric vehicle supply chains. Russia gains whenever North American disputes complicate Arctic coordination. Neither Beijing nor Moscow needs the alliance to collapse. They benefit from delay, mistrust, duplicated systems, and reduced confidence in American reliability. This is how compounding structural stress works. Tariffs create uncertainty. Uncertainty accelerates diversification. Diversification requires infrastructure. Infrastructure creates contracts. Contracts create political constituencies. Those constituencies resist returning to dependence. Each consequence reduces the options available for reversing the next one. The situation is not simply bad from several directions. The directions reinforce one another, and the policy's central irony becomes impossible to avoid. Washington used 50% tariffs on solid $28 billion to prove that Canada had no exit before August 19. The pressure became the political and financial justification for Canada to finish building one. By the time a compromise is announced, the visible crisis may ease. The structural response will continue moving. The entire confrontation now rests on four facts. A 50% tariff threatens approximately $28 billion in Canadian exports on August 19. The Port of Vancouver already connects Canada with 170 markets and moves roughly $1 billion in trade each day. Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is designed to unlock more than $100 billion in annual capacity. And Canada entered the tariff crisis with European defense access, Gulf negotiations, South American agreements, and nearly 20 economic and security partnerships already advancing. None of that makes Canada invulnerable. Workers can lose shifts. Exporters can lose customers. American consumers can pay more. Pension funds can absorb weaker industrial earnings. The deeply integrated North American economy cannot be separated cleanly, without damaging families and communities on both sides of the border. But the title of this story is no longer Canadian dependence. It is the declining usefulness of that dependence as a weapon. Washington expected Canada to fold because the old map gave Canada one overwhelmingly important customer. Carney's strategy did not attempt the impossible task of replacing that customer before August 19. It secured enough routes, agreements, and institutional access to make replacement a process rather than a fantasy. That is the philosophical difference between theater and preparation. Theater announces a deadline. Preparation signs the agreement in February, activates it in April, completes it in June, advances the port in July, and carries the documents into the room before the threat arrives. Theater displays power. Preparation changes what power can accomplish. Buffett's reputation principle provides the final judgment. Money lost in a tariff dispute can eventually be recovered. A duty can be reduced. A temporary agreement can be signed. But once a partner decides that dependence itself is unsafe, every future investment remembers the lesson. 50%, $28 billion. August 19th, $100 billion. The first three numbers describe Washington's trap. The fourth describes the scale of Canada's exit. Negotiations will continue. There may be exemptions, concessions, and declarations of victory. But the port strategy will remain. Safe access will remain. The UAE and Ecuador agreements will move toward implementation. Canadian businesses will continue searching for customers that cannot be removed by one American order. Washington expected Canada to fold. Carney had already secured a direction in which it could move. The deadline is approaching. The exit is already open. Before you go, I mentioned it earlier, and I mean it. If this trade war has you even slightly worried about your retirement, the Buffett Blueprint is the guide I put together for exactly this moment. Your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income, one plan, written in plain English, that you can start using this week. The link is right below this video and in the pinned comment. The Buffett Blueprint. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.